Good morning or good afternoon, whatever part of North America you're in. Welcome to today's presentation on PFOAs and PFOSs. I'm an engineer with Maricopa County Environmental Services Department, Water and Wastewater Treatment Program, which covers the greater Phoenix area in Arizona. I'm also the chairperson of the Water Treatment Committee of AZ Water, our local affiliate of AWWA, American Water Works Association, and Water Environment Federation. If you are interested in joining AZ Water, please go to www.azwater.org. Before we begin the webinar, a few housekeeping notes. There's a chat window at the bottom of your panel. Please use that to send any questions that you have. And at the end of the presentation, all four presentations, we'll have a general questions and answers session. 1.5 professional development hours are available. A PDH certificate for this webinar is available as a handout during the webinar. You can download the handout from the GoToWebinar control panel's handout pane by clicking on the PDH certificate handout. The handout will download as an Adobe PDF file. If for some reason you are unable to download the handout during the webinar, the contact information and instructions for requesting the PDH certificate will be sent to you in a follow-up email to all attendees approximately 1 hour after the webinar ends. So let's get into the presentations. My colleagues and I, we review thousands of water treatment projects in the county over the past 10 years, and things are going smoothly. And then we get something like PFOA and PFOS is something new to me, and I won't even try to pronounce it. So let's get into our first speaker. Our first speaker, I have Shailene Thomas of AMEC Foster Wheeler, and her presentation is The Changing Regulatory Landscape of Emerging Contaminants. Welcome, Shailene. Take it away.
Thank you. As Eric said, I'm Shailene Thomas with AMEC Foster Wheeler. I reside there as the Emerging Contaminant Program Manager, where we've done work related to emerging contaminants and specifically PFOS and PFOA at over 100 locations. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today. Let's get into it. So first I'd like to cover just a general introduction as a preface for the other three speakers regarding what this compound class is, what the definition of it is, and how has it evolved to where we're at today. Discuss a little bit about the nomenclature, which can generally be very confusing if you're first learning about the topic. We'll then go over the U.S. regulatory trends, talking about the current criteria and the basis of those criteria, as well as what my crystal ball is showing and what I feel the anticipated trends are, what the future landscape might hold for this emerging contaminant class. So why are we here? What I put up here is a letter to the Environmental Science and Technology Journal regarding the detection of poly and perfluoroalkyl substances in the U.S. What this article does, which was just released in August 9th of this year, is it implies several different sources of PFAS chemicals across the U.S., including over 600 military sites, over 500 airports, industrial sites, as well as over 8,500 different wastewater treatment plants as potential PFAS sources. This academic article, it was published on the 9th, and that very same day, a press release from NPR, Washington Post, and other major news streams also picked up that story. What I want to illustrate here is that there is a substantial emphasis around the social drivers influencing action for this contaminant class. With it being an election year, in combination with the ability of social media to organize large groups of people for a cause, we're seeing substantial changes specifically with this class as it relates to the regulatory environment. Some other examples I'd like to illustrate just from across the country. We're seeing Colorado Springs with Peterson Air Force Base, potential drinking water contamination there of a community of approximately 70,000 people. Litchfield, New Hampshire with residents there getting blood testing, all the way down to Alabama, in Decatur, Alabama, with a manufacturing facility there with contaminated water. Also here in Arizona, we saw right around the time that the EPA health advisories were published in May of this year, several different communities being affected. So getting into the definition, what are PFAS? Dr. Bob Buck from DuPont, who's now with ChemHours, published a document back in 2011, a position paper about nomenclature around the term PFC. What I'd like to do here for you today is just give you a general overview, and I'm simplifying obviously here to illustrate a point that within the whole breadth and depth of fluorinated substances within that class, there is one subset called perfluoroalkyl substances. PFAAs, they're often called now, includes perfluorocarboxylic acids and perfluorosulfonic acids. These two chemical classes make up what often people refer to as PFCs. Dr. Bob Buck has suggested we do not term them PFCs, as the term PFCs is really related to greenhouse gases. Within the perfluorocarboxylic acid term, there's something that most people are aware of if they've heard anything about this emerging contaminant class, which is PFOA, and in the PFSA class, PFOS. These two compounds, PFOS and PFOA, are the most persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic compounds of the entire class. They are each 8 carbon chain lengths, fully fluorinated compounds with functional end groups, either being the carboxylic acid or the sulfonic acid. These wonderful bonds that are there that make them great for use in material science and in all different applications also is what makes them detrimental from an environmental and human health perspective. The terminology moved from PFCs to PFAS a handful of years ago when researchers realized, after the manufacturers decided to substitute polyfluoroalkyl substances from perfluoroalkyl substances because they were persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. These polyfluoroalkyl substances, such as 8,2-fluorotellumer alcohol and others, actually can serve as precursors in the natural environment. So as the manufacturers used polyfluoroalkyl substances as substitutes to make safer products, these compounds actually break down in the environment to form the persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic compounds. From a uses and sources perspective, it has been ubiquitously used across industry and commerce for more than 40 years. In the oil and gas extraction industry, used as an additive to improve the drilling efficiency process. In the electroplating industry, used both as a mist suppressant and a wetting agent for both hard chrome and decorative chrome plating. In the manufacturing process industry, it has been used both as an intermediate or as a byproduct or as an aftermarket application for several different products. In the consumer industry, which I think is most mainstream in the media, of course it's been used in cookware such as Teflon, carpeting, and textiles such as Stainmaster and Gore-Tex, and in food packaging. In the semiconductor industry, it's been used in the photolithography process. And of course, another one that's very well known is in aqueous film forming foam, or AFFF, in the support of petroleum-based hydrocarbon fires. From a history perspective, just taking a step back and looking at where this started and where we are at now, these compounds were first introduced back in the 1950s. 3M is the only manufacturer, has been the only manufacturer of PFOS. DuPont, which introduced PFOA, DuPont, 3M, and 6 other manufacturers manufactured PFOA. By the mid-1960s, the Department of Defense and the Navy specifically issued a MIL specification for AFFF firefighting foam. That MIL specification was adopted by FAA. Additionally, around that same time, the Food and Drug Administration approved the use of PFAS compounds in food packaging. By the late 1970s, 3M was able to detect concentrations of PFOA in the blood of workers, and by the 1980s, environmental impacts started to become more apparent. Case in point was a facility in Parkersburg, West Virginia. This was a PFOA manufacturing facility that DuPont had that contaminated 6 different water drinking supply districts across 2 different states, resulting in a class action lawsuit in 2005 and subsequent individual lawsuits against DuPont. By the early 2000s, 2002 specifically, 3M decided to phase out the production of PFOS. Subsequently, with EPA pressures, they established a 2010-2015 PFOA stewardship program in which 3M and the other manufacturers agreed to phase out production by the end of 2015, which I'm happy to say has happened. That said, however, although all manufacturing of PFOA and PFOS has ceased in the United States, PFOA is still manufactured in other countries. Let's move now into a regulatory trend and talking about the historical analysis and what the look ahead is. This pyramid is meant to illustrate where the initial issue has been and the focus has been from a regulatory perspective and where we are now. So at the start, in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the primary manufacturers, 3M, DuPont, and the 6 other manufacturers were the focus of any issues related to PFOS or PFOA. Case in point, the C8 project in Parkersburg, West Virginia, as well as a handful of other sites by 3M, a few in Minnesota and 1 in Alabama are mentioned here. By the late 2000s and early as 2009, the Department of Defense and both the EPA established an emerging contaminant program and evaluated PFAS compounds initially as part of that program. Aqueous film forming foam with the Department of Defense became a primary spot of focus as a result. Fort Smith Air Force Base, Warminster, and Pease are all examples of sites where there has been aqueous film forming foam use, as well as detection and contamination. The UCMR3, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the list for UCMR3, which is the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, was published in May 2012. In addition to the 30-plus chemicals, it did include PFOS and PFOA and 4 other chemicals. These chemicals were sampled from 2013 to 2015 at all public utilities serving 10,000 or more people and a subset of those serving less than 2,000 people. Those data were published preliminarily in October and earlier this year. Subsequent to that, the Safe Drinking Water Act, again under EPA's direction, published the Lifetime Health Advisories. We saw substantial activity in late 2015 and into this year now, moving not with the manufacturer focus, not with the military focus, but now moving into the manufacturer and industrial sector focus. With Hoosick Falls in New York as an example, Bennington, Vermont, as well as Pownell, Vermont. On the right-hand side, you see here drinking water, groundwater, soil, and air. This is meant to illustrate that the primary focus to date has been on drinking water supply, contamination, and impact with the health advisory, specifically under the Safe Drinking Water Act. We are seeing, that said, regulations now moving past the Safe Drinking Water Act and into a circular environment. The table I'm showing here is an illustration of criteria established across several different states across the U.S. As it relates to both PFOS and PFOA. As I mentioned, in 2016, the EPA Office of Water established a 70 parts per trillion, 0.07 parts per billion level for both PFOS and PFOA or added together if they are co-located. Several states here have published criteria, and as you can see, they're quite variable, but we are seeing substantial movement in the recent year and just in the last few months. New Jersey, as an example, highlighted in purple, has put out a recommended proposed value of 14 parts per billion just in September. Minnesota identified that they will be reevaluating the criteria established in 2009 as part of their hurdles, and that their criteria are likely to be lower and published by the end of the year. California, another example, under Prop 65, identified an intent to list in September, and they have defined that they will have established criteria by the end of the year. Something notable here, again, outside of Safe Drinking Water Act, the EPA RSLs under CERCLA program are likely to be published this month and definitely before the end of the year. So what are we seeing from a regulatory shifts perspective? The Safe Drinking Water Act, which I already mentioned, has implied several water utilities as a result of the combined UCMR3 results as well as the health advisory publication. We're seeing movement into CERCLA and states taking the regulatory and promulgated rule into their own hands. In the state of New York, as an example, they had an emergency adoption rule back in May that identified both PFAS and PFOA as hazardous substances. In the state of New Hampshire, they took the health advisories at the federal level, adopted them as their ambient groundwater quality standards. In Vermont, seeing an emergency rule there. Minnesota evaluation, as I mentioned. For future considerations, I do see NIPD's permitting as a potential point of evaluation for non-point sources of PFAS. I also see natural resource damage claim potential. And under the TSCA Reform Act that was passed earlier this year, for fluorochemicals outside of PFOS and PFOA being considered for reform. So other things to identify from an outlook perspective, I do think that the analytes that are considered now are definitely going to expand from a list perspective. Academics have identified more than 200 perfluoroalkyl substances out there. PFAS and PFOA are the only one with criteria at the federal level. We are seeing criteria as shown here at the state level. I already mentioned the regulatory framework shift from Safe Drinking Water Act and into CERCLA. Something else to watch out for is with the new health advisories and considering of PFAS and PFOA being additive, we do think that this trend will follow and potentially other chemicals will be added. We have seen this at a state and regional EPA level. So in summary and as a takeaway, just know that the use of PFAS chemicals has been ubiquitous globally. They've been used in commerce for nearly 50 years. They are found both in humans at over 99% level and in the environment. The regulatory drivers are evolving quickly, and although we aren't seeing regulatory movement here in Arizona, I think it is worthwhile to evaluate all the different state regulatory agencies and what's going on so that you can understand and predict where things are moving for you. So proactive management is essential to understanding your risk and liability. With that, thank you for your time, and I think I'll stop showing my screen and pass it on to Eva.
Shailene, thank you so much for that presentation. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Our second out of 4 presentations will be from Dr. Eva Steinle-Darling of Carollo Engineers. Go ahead, Eva.
Thank you, Eric. I need to, here we go, switch to the correct screen. I think I'm there now. Thanks to Shailene for such a great introduction. My presentation is going to build on that. My background is that I'm a senior technologist with Carollo Engineers. I'm focused on constituents of emerging concern, both in water treatment and in potable reuse. And I think one of the things to observe, particularly as we look at the trend to potentially looking at these compounds in surface waters as well as in discharges as well as potable reuse, is the likelihood that they will be co-located. In other words, that this additive regulatory criterion will apply is much higher when you've got kind of these aggregated sources as opposed to individual sources of contamination. So that's an interesting observation, sort of extending from Shailene's presentation. Today I want to talk about not so much the regulatory environment, but give an overview of the treatment toolbox that we have available to us before we dive into the two main case study presentations that will follow mine. Just a brief overview of my presentation. I want to talk just briefly about the physical and chemical properties of these compounds that make them so unique, both in the positive and in the negative, and then dive right into the treatment approaches with a pretty simple concept. First, we'll talk about what doesn't work. Then we'll talk more about what we know works, and then just a brief glimpse into some of our more potential future solutions for treatment. So, as mentioned a few times now, the unique chemical properties of PFOS and PFOA really drive its end uses. So if you look at the chemical backbone, this is the perfluorinated chain. Each of the carbon backbone chain, all the hydrogens have been substituted with fluorines. The strength of this carbon-fluorine bond and the extreme electronegativity of fluorine gives it this extreme chemical inertness, which is really what we want, why they're used in firefighting, because you can't destroy those compounds. In fact, they smother the fire. But of course, on the environmental side, the less desirable side effect is that they're incredibly difficult to destroy. They're also, by virtue of this slick backbone, if you will, considered both hydrophobic and lipophobic, so they repel stains and prevent wrinkles, all those good things that we like in our consumer products. The problem with that is that they accumulate in protein tissues and blood, and they're not sequestered in fat. So that's at some of the heart of why they're problematic from a health perspective. And then finally, looking at the end groups that kind of define which one is PFOA, the octanoic acid, versus PFOS, the sulfonic acid, we have kind of a surfactant group. So these compounds are surface active. That means they make a really good coating material. That's why our pizza boxes and our popcorn bags are coated in them, as well as our Teflon pans. But it also means they're somewhat difficult to measure and sample accurately. So you really want to make sure that your sampling protocols are developed specific to these compounds so that you get accurate results when you're sampling. So moving right back into treatment, I'm showing a graph here of that summarizes what doesn't work, and this is typical, but it's from a really good comprehensive study published in 2014, and the graph shows on the top half the fraction removed of PFOS and PFOA as a function of a number of different treatment processes. So what we see here in the middle is below the dashed line or inside the dashed line are our limits of detection, and in many cases the removal is less than what we can detect, honestly, by these processes. At the top of the screen you can see many bars show limited or no removal, and processes that are examples in here are very conventional physical, chemical separation, coagulation. The DAF is dissolved air flotation, microfiltration and ultrafiltration, MFUF. They tend to remove particles but not these dissolved constituents. Even advanced processes such as UV-based advanced oxidation with hydrogen peroxide, for example, and a process that we would use in some very advanced treatment, even for potable reuse, doesn't do much good for these compounds Conventional oxidative processes, chlorine, chlorine dioxide, same way. Again, this is attributable to the extreme chemical inertness of these treatment processes. Another thing to observe is that there are a couple of processes, ozonation, for example, that are actually showing some formation, and that's really what the bottom half of this graph shows. These are full-scale plants. You can see them labeled by number. They remained anonymous in this paper. And some of them actually showed formation of PFOS and PFOA, and that is attributable to transformation of precursor products that Shailene introduced in her presentation. So we're not actually creating more PFAS, but we're transforming the precursor products into PFOS and PFOA that are then recalcitrant through any additional treatment. The good news is, the reverse osmosis, which is a high-pressure physical separation process using membranes, is excellent for PFOS removal. It also is excellent for PFOA. This particular example shows the removal for PFOS in a study done almost 10 years ago now, actually 10 years ago now, by a colleague of mine, Jian Tang, and his advisors, showing that you get 99% or better rejection for most situations with a number of different RO membranes. And this is typical of many facilities where you would have RO for treatment, usually for other purposes. I don't know of any facilities that use reverse osmosis specifically for the removal of PFAS, but when you do have an RO system, it does really well at removing these compounds as well. Nanofiltration is a process that is very similar to reverse osmosis. The only difference is that the membranes are a little bit what we call looser, so they let a little more pass. They let monovalent salts pass, so they're considered softening membranes as opposed to desalination membranes, for example. But they have the benefit of significantly lower operating costs because you don't need as high a pressure to push the water through the membrane. In addition, the concentrate isn't as concentrated, if you will, and so disposal is often easier for nanofiltration reject than for RO. And what this graph shows from a study a little more recently is that nanofiltration does really well at removal of PFOS and PFOA, the ones of primary concern at this point, but is not quite as good potentially at the very small molecular weight compounds. So you see this graph shows rejection between 50 and 100%, so that's removal percentage, as a function of the size of these molecules. So the bigger the molecules, PFOS and PFOA, are removed very well, but there's that one little data point towards the low end of the molecular weight spectrum where the removal is significantly less. GAC is most effective for longer chain PFAS, and this is kind of a trend that's developing over the course of my slides where PFOS and PFOA are removed pretty well by a number of technologies, and those are the ones that are currently regulated, but as regulation potentially moves on to the shorter chain PFAS compounds, we're going to have to start exploring some other options. So this graph shows just a comparison of the removal through a GAC filter. You can see the C over C naught, so the effluent concentration over the influent. That means the level at 1.0 is no removal at all. If anything is above that, it means it's actually shedding from that filter in concentrations higher than what's coming in. And anything below 1.0 shows that there's removal. And so to highlight some of the data points here, for PFOA, you get about 30,000 bed volumes for this particular GAC full-scale facility. Again, the anonymized utility 20 that uses GAC specifically for PFAS removal. They get about 30,000 bed volumes before breakthrough. And compare that to the larger PFOS molecule, and you can see they get twice the number of bed volumes before they see breakthrough for PFOS. And that's compared to the perfluorooctanoic acid, PFBA, which breaks through almost immediately and then actually sheds off the column once you start getting higher concentrations of the larger PFAS compounds in the column and past the filter. Anion exchange is another option, similar in process to GAC, other than that you've got a specific interaction as opposed to a general absorptive interaction. I don't want to go into this detail in this graph in particular detail because we have a whole presentation devoted to ion exchange coming right up, but I wanted to highlight a few things. This is showing removal of various PFAS compounds as a function of two different surface waters. The remainder have kind of grayed out. So these are just two different surface waters, and so you can see, at least, especially at the lower end, lower size end, the C4, so that's Perfluorooctanoic acid, there's a pretty significant difference in removal just between the different water chemistries of two different surface water sources. The other thing to notice is chemistry in and of itself makes a difference. If you compare the C4, which is perfluorooctanoic acid, versus the PFBS, which is the butyl sulfonate, so C4 compounds in both cases, but the sulfonate makes a huge difference in the removal and selectivity of this ion exchange resin compared to the carboxylic acid. So this is all just to say ion exchange can be very effective, but your water chemistry as well as the exact nature of which compounds you're looking to remove and what you have in your source water can have a big impact on the effectiveness of your treatment. So to summarize, I'm taking the same graph I showed you earlier from the Tim Appelman's paper, and I'm inserting the component I omitted earlier, which is to show GAC, ion exchange, and RO are really some of the better alternatives for removing the, PFAS compounds. The other processes simply are not effective. And so the process selection really depends on your treatment goals. You know, your GAC process is effective, especially for long-chained compounds. You have a lower capital cost. Operation and maintenance is on the lower end. And your residual considerations are, you know, spent carbon or regeneration. That is a manageable cost in most scenarios. Ion exchange is very similar. The selectivity depends really a lot on the resin. The capital cost is similar. It's just, you know, similar process in the sense of what equipment you need. The operation and maintenance cost is also low to medium. Really depends on what the resin costs to replace and or regenerate. Finally, nanofiltration and RO are you know, more of a slam dunk in terms of the treatment that they will provide, but the capital cost of these plants is very high. The operation and maintenance costs can also be high depending on membrane replacement as well as the pressure at which you need to operate the membranes and the power to pump at that pressure. And finally, in a consideration that I often think of as the tail wagging the dog, the liquid concentrate disposal from a nanofiltration or RO process can be cost prohibitive for many of these applications. So all of our existing options can work quite well, but they have one fundamental flaw, and that is they focus on sequestration of the PFAS compounds, not destruction. So in the end, you're still going to have, you know, a spent resin, spent carbon, or a liquid concentrate stream where all of these PFAS compounds are concentrated, and you have to do something with them. Now, landfilling is one potential option, but you know, as someone who's looking towards the future and thinking of what other alternatives we have, I like to always think, can we do better? And so there is quite a bit of research that says, yes, we can, but it's still, like I just implied, at the research scale. So I want to highlight just one of several potential future solutions that's looking at defluoridation using Persulfate AOP. So I mentioned earlier that conventional UV advanced oxidation processes are ineffective for destruction of PFAS. But here I'm showing a graph from a recent paper comparing a number of different Persulfate activation methods for AOP, and they're graded against each other, if you will, by the amount of fluoride created. And of course, if you're defluorinating, if you're actually trying to destroy these compounds, what you're going to get is fluoride coming off. and that's what you want. So you can see the first one I'm showing is high temperature potassium persulfate. That doesn't work as well because simply in practice, because you'd have to heat it to very high temperatures to get that, and that we know is cost prohibitive when you're talking about treating large volumes of water. The next best option along these is a UV activated persulfate advanced oxidation process. It's almost as effective in this comparison, and there are some applications where this might make sense. Carollo is working on a research collaboration right now looking to test a UV activated persulfate destructive mechanism for removing PFAS from nanofiltration concentrate. So to look at this as a two-step process where you might have a nanofilter ahead of time to remove it, concentrate that stream, and then make the actual destructive process a little bit more cost-effective. So that's just one kind of highlight I wanted to point out, looking to the future. But at this point, I'd like to thank you for your attention and pass the presentation back to Eric for our two case studies.
Eva, thank you so much for educating our audience. We're two for two today out of the 4 presentations, so I'll move on to the next presenter. Our next presenter is Nathan Hagelin of AMEC Foster Wheeler from the great state of Portland, Maine. And the title of his presentation is Sustainable Removal of Per and Polyfluoroalkyl Substances, or PFAS, from groundwater using synthetic media. Thank you very much, Nathan. Go for it.
Thank you, Eric. Just checking, make sure you can hear me and that you can see my screen.
Loud and clear, and we see you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you today. This is Nathan Hagelin. I work with AMEC Foster Wheeler in Portland, Maine, as mentioned. And for AMEC Foster Wheeler, I'm a practice area leader for environmental remediation, which means I get to dabble in a number of things, and been spending a lot of time lately thinking about and working with this emerging contaminant class because it is such an interesting challenge. I want to tell you today about one specific solution that we think shows some promise for water treatment, which may be of interest to our audience today. I certainly hope it is. First of all, I want to acknowledge our teaming partner, Emerging Contaminants Treatment Technology, ECT, shown here. We've partnered with them to bring this technology from the laboratory into the field on an application that I'm going to show you today. ECT is a technology vendor who we partner with from time to time, and they have gained some acclaim with their successes in treating 1,4-dioxane using a similar but excuse me, slightly different media. I'll talk briefly, recap some of the stuff you've already heard today from our first 2 presenters, and then, as I mentioned, I want to focus specifically on this one particular resin used in one particular setting, show you the results at bench and pilot scale, and tell you a little bit about where we're headed with a couple of full-scale designs using this technology and some ongoing research that we're doing. So sources of PFAS, we've talked a little bit about that, and I guess really the message here is a lot of sources, a lot of exposures, kind of ubiquitous, and we are finding in a sort of environmental context, just about everywhere we look. My company has been focused, at least at the onset here, at looking at military installations and the application of film-forming foam, and started out by looking at fire training areas, but are now broadly looking at all the various places that aqueous film-forming foams were used and stored and released at crash sites and the like. And we're finding that this recalcitrant compound is just about everywhere. We have yet to sample a fire training area at any military installation where we have not found PFCs. Of course, we have a very difficult treatment standard to meet now as of May 2016 at 70 parts per trillion combined PFOS and PFOA. So that presents some unique challenges for us from both the analytical and treatment side. and particularly challenging because, as has been mentioned, this is a really difficult compound to break down, and it's that carbon and fluorine bond itself that's so particularly strong, which basically makes it untreatable or very difficult to destroy. We've heard a little bit about that already today. We do have granular activated carbon. Granular activated carbon has served a really important role for us here in the early goings with this contaminant class because it does work, and we do have some completed drinking water exposure pathways that have to be treated on an emergency basis, and thank goodness we have GAC because it is reliable. Whether or not it's cost effective is another matter, but at least we do have one technology that can help us in an emergency response type of mode. From my perspective, I think where we are on remediation technology is perfectly reflective of where we are with this emerging contaminant class. There are few proven technologies because, frankly, there have been few opportunities to prove technologies at full field scale. They're really tough compounds to destroy. There have been, until recently, really a lack of enforceable standards. Shailene showed us that there's a number of states that have adopted standards, and we now have a health advisory from EPA, which is not quite an enforceable standard, but it is being enforced. We're working on a couple of projects now where the health advisories have been written into consent orders, and we are building treatment systems now to treat to those health advisories. And as I mentioned, most of what we're doing is kind of emergency response. We find, oh my goodness, this groundwater is contaminated, and the contamination is widespread, and it's impacting public and private water supplies, and we have to take them offline on an emergency basis. And obviously we have to address those with technologies that are proven. So also, most of the sites, at least from my perspective, working first through Department of Defense opportunities, but now expanding into more commercial, industrial sites. We really haven't gotten too far past site investigations, only starting to transition into remedial investigations, so mostly presence absence. So that's not much to build on when it comes to doing remediation systems. But I do see that I do certainly predict that we will be there very soon. And again, the proven technologies, the ones that we have limitations and are expensive, as Eva was just mentioning in the prior talk. So there is this opportunity, and it's relatively urgent because these contaminants are widespread. We're not only finding them at military installations, but also at airports, oil and gas refineries, and in industrialized communities from a number of applications. The widespread use of aqueous film-forming foam has resulted in persistent groundwater plumes, long, dilute groundwater plumes that do not bioattenuate on their own. We have this emergency response municipal and private drinking water supplies that we've been chasing. We now also know of several locations where we've been testing fish tissue and have found these contaminants to bioaccumulate in fish, and we've had to shut down some fisheries as a result of this contaminant class and put in interceptor systems to cut off groundwater discharge to the surface water bodies that contain the fish. A lot of widespread and relatively troubling media coverage. If you sign up for a news feed on PFCs or PFAS, you'll get a mailbox full just about every day. And then proven technologies, which are primarily limited to GAC at this point, have shortcomings. They do let short-chain compounds through, and the change-outs are relatively frequent. So from an O&M perspective, it can be expensive. So innovation is needed. So I'll mention, as I mentioned, I will talk specifically about some testing that we did on some synthetic media. First, isotherm testing we did to try to sort out from a whole bunch of media ones that might show promise. And we did find some that showed promise, and we moved forward to some column testing as shown in this photograph on this slide. And we did some work with regeneration because we thought it would be very important for this technology in order to compete with granular activated carbon to be able to be regenerated and reused, not necessarily in all settings, but in many settings. The ability to regenerate the media and reuse it is what makes it cost-effective and sustainable. So we looked at a number of different types of synthetic media, ion exchange media, polymeric media, carbonaceous media, and these media have been used for many applications. Manufacturers of these media have dozens to hundreds that they've developed over the years for various applications, sitting in warehouses just waiting for an opportunity like an emerging contaminant class to treat. And we took the advice of some of the manufacturers on a handful of resins that might be effective for this application, with an understanding of the configuration of the media itself and the compounds in this contaminant class. And we tested them, and as I mentioned, we found a few. And then we have found it looks promising for relatively indefinite reuse for the media. Quick shot of the isotherms, just isolating 8 different media that we tested on PFOS and PFOA. And we basically, the lower graphs, the lower graphs on this chart were the ones that showed most promise for removing PFAS, so we took those into our column studies. And the column studies, we used real groundwater from one of the sites, one of the Air Force bases we're working on. And this is just a snapshot of what that groundwater contamination looked like at this site. There's one little label in this figure in the very upper portion of the image. That is the test site. That was a fire training area. And there was a monitoring well actually closer to the middle of this image in a second plume at this location that we used for the bench scale testing. And we see here that we had about 6.7 total PFAS concentration, and of that about 3 parts per billion was PFOS. So this is the setup. As I mentioned, we took those 3 resins from our isotherm studies and we coined them resins A, B, and C, and we ran them in these columns. And the drums here are 30-gallon drums that we brought groundwater from the site to the laboratory. And we had one empty control vessel to compare the results to. And here's a snapshot of the results. You can, the blue column shows the mass of total PFAS that we delivered to the resin. The green column shows the mass removed by the resin. So you can see that resin A came up a little bit short, but both resins B and C removed all the contaminant. In fact, we never got breakthrough on either resin B or C before we ran out of groundwater to run through those little column tests. We ran 60 gallons of contaminated groundwater in total. And then the red bar shows that we were not able, with the regenerate solution that we used in the laboratory, to remove the PFAS from the media, but resin C, we got just about all of it back. So that led us to select resin C for some pilot scale trials that I will talk about next. But first, to summarize, here is an image of the media, and we changed its name from resin C to Sorbix A3F when we were done. Sorbix being an ion exchange adsorbent to treat AFFF. And that is a strong base anion exchange. Again, we didn't see any breakthrough. We got probably within laboratory error all of our contaminants off the media using a solvent brine solution. And that led us to pilot scale testing in the field. This is a snapshot of our pilot scale test. We're going to talk a little bit about the influent concentration, which was a little different for our pilot scale than it was for our bench, and a little bit about the process design of this system, and we'll talk about the results. This is a zoom in on the image I showed earlier, the top part of that image where I mentioned there was a fire training area. You can see the outline of the fire training area, and what's superimposed on this image is an existing groundwater treatment system that was here for treating fuels and solvents. from an era when we didn't know we had PFCs in this groundwater. So that building there has a full-scale treatment system, and that's a piping network for an extraction well array, and the blue bars are where we recharge the treated effluent. And ironically, it was only within a couple of months that this treatment system was decommissioned, having done its job on chlorinated VOCs and fuels, that we discovered the PFCs, and we're therefore able to take advantage of the infrastructure here to do this pilot scale test. We had extraction wells in the ground, a great space to work in, and this kind of underscores the challenge with this contaminant treatment class, particularly in this fire training area setting where it's essentially a reopener for us after having spent all that time and energy treating for other contaminants. We now know we have an ongoing problem here that we have to deal with. The water from this area was different, about 15 times more contaminated than what we used at the bench scale, which actually presented a nice opportunity for us. This groundwater is actually quite a bit more contaminated with PFAS than most groundwater we've encountered so far. Most groundwater has in the hundreds of ppt range for total PFAS concentration that we're seeing so far, but this is a more concentrated, about 100 times that, at 100 parts per billion total PFAS concentration. So it represents a nice treatment challenge for us, seeing as we have to get all the way down to 70 parts per trillion. And in fact, with some of the work we've done with various water purveyors who have the challenge of municipal supply wells with PFCs, really their standard is non-detect. So this water represented quite a challenge to get to non-detect, but what it gave us really was an opportunity to really pound it to this ion exchange media to see what it could take. Here's a schematic of the setup. The great, very interesting and important thing about this test is that we ran it side by side, granular activated carbon, with our Sorbix A3F. The GAC that was used was a Calgon product. It was the FilterSorb 400. And they designed this system for us, Calgon did, which was nice because it took away some of the potential or perceived bias, as we were really most interested in the resin, but we were really interested in the resin from the perspective of, is it as or more effective, and can it be long-term more cost-effective than granular activated carbon? On the basis of our our bench studies, we ran at a 2.5-minute empty bed contact time in these vessels, which were about 2 cubic feet each. On the ion exchange side, the carbon each vessel at 5-minute empty bed contact time. So when you add those all up in series, we had a total of 20 minutes of empty bed contact time. But as you'll see later on, we didn't really pay too much attention to the last 2 vessels on the carbon train. This is another image of the setups. You can see the kind of canisters we're doing. They look a lot like the kind of system you might have in your basement on a point of exposure treatment system. In the foreground there we have some filters and the pumps there, process pumps bringing the water into the system. This water does contain a lot of iron, and we tried to filter that out the best we could. The full-scale system, as I'll mention in a minute, we're needing to put in iron sequestration because the iron is not a friend of the media, neither granular activated carbon nor ion exchange. So it is something to be dealt with in a pre-treatment scenario. Here are ion exchange vessels again. It's closer up. You can see all the valving, etc. Now we'll go straight to the results. This is PFOA. So that's one of the 8-chain carbons, the carboxylic acid. And what you see here is relatively better performance, and you'll see this in the next series of, I'm going to go through graphs for first PFOA and PFOS because those are the primary contaminants of concern, but then I'm going to step back and I'm going to show you short chain, medium chain, long chain, and the relative performance of the carboxylic acids versus the sulfonates. For all the contaminants, excuse me, that we detected in this particular groundwater. So the black bar here is the lead vessel on carbon, and you can see the breakthrough there relatively quickly. Breakthrough here I'm just defining simply as the health advisory, 70 parts per trillion. had about 3,000 bed volumes before we broke through, whereas for comparison, the lead vessel on the resin broke through at closer to 8,000 bed volumes. You can see there wasn't much better performance on the second vessel, we'll call it the lag vessel, on the granular activated carbon. So essentially, as soon as it broke through, almost as soon as it broke through the lead vessel, it started breaking through the lag vessel. So that's PFOA. This is what they look like when you normalize for empty bed contact time. So the graph I showed you before wasn't quite fair to the resin because, of course, the empty bed contact time was twice as long for the granular activated carbon as it was for the resin. And what I've done here with these charts going forward, with the exception of PFOS, you'll see this in a moment, is try to normalize that so you can see sort of straight up an equivalent bed volume, the difference in the performance. Now here's the PFOS. This chart is not normalized, but the next one is, and you can see that PFOS and pretty much across the board, the sulfonates in particular, the ion exchange media performed really much better than granular activated carbon, at least in this particular water. And I don't want to suggest that this is going to necessarily be the case for all water everywhere, but it certainly was our story. So really, similar performance on GAC between PFOA and PFOS, but much better performance of the resin on PFOS than PFOA. And you can see we never even saw it come through the lag vessel after 20,000 bed volumes. That's the purple line. Looking at that normalized, you can see how much better the resin performed. And now just running through the rest of our contaminants in this PFAS soup that we had at this particular site. This is one of the precursor compounds. And throughout this chart, the green bar is the resin performance and the orange bar is the granular activated carbon and the influent concentration across the top as kind of a control. Another precursor compound, this is a sulfonate, never broke through the resin. I'll move up to PFBS, which in some areas is the primary contaminant of concern for PFAS. And you can see we didn't get any breakthrough at all on the resin. Whereas at PFBA, the acid, carboxylic acid, we get a much more similar performance. So this is the sort of the weaker part of the story here as far as the resin is concerned. Better performance, but not markedly better. Here's a 6-carbon compound in a sulfonate. Here's a 6-carbon in a hexanoic acid. 7-carbon sulfonate. 7-carbon acid. And then to the PFNA, 9 carbons. And here we didn't get any breakthrough with the resin at all. Just in a summary bar chart, you can see here at a glance the compounds for which the resin was particularly better, had a higher removal capacity, normalized again to the 5-minute empty bed contact time. And then this is the only chart I have really that shows the performance of the media as pertains to regeneration. So the post-regeneration really performed, so this now, the media has been regenerated. It's been bathed in several volumes, several bed volumes of this high concentration solvent brine mix. We were able to capture and quantify that we had removed all of the PFAS from the media. We, of course, rinsed it, put it back in service, and showed that it performed really just as well after regeneration as before. So that's a good part of our success story, the second good part of our success story. So why is this working so well? And I think really the fact that what occurred to me as I was working on this was, well, we need both, because we tested a lot of different regenerate solutions, salts alone, solvents alone, or alcohols alone, and then when we put them together and did the combined solvent-salt regeneration, that's when we really started to get the media to come off. And I think what we realized there is that the ion exchange media is so successful because it takes advantage of the contaminant's ability to both exchange ions and adsorb to the media. So as far as the regeneration is concerned, it's the high concentration salt that dislodges the anionic head off of the resin, and then the high concentration solvent that desorbs the PFAS molecules from the resin. So we're really taking advantage of the unique properties of PFAS to both exchange ions and adsorb. So we're in the process of, we have now designed and will construct in the spring 2 systems at the same installation. This is a modeling output, particle tracking. You can see a fence of extraction wells there. We have about a 600 gallon per minute system we're designing there to cut off a plume that is just up gradient of a public supply well. It's hard to see it, but it is named there in the lower middle part of the picture. And that well, which happened to be located between the runway and the taxiway on a former Air Force base, was indeed supplying drinking water to the surrounding community and is now offline. It's getting its own granular activated carbon treatment system being put on by the municipality, but the plume itself, the cleanup of the plume itself, is our responsibility, and we're using the ion exchange media for that application, and we are regenerating it on site and reusing it. The second system is up in the area I showed you before, where the fire training area used to be. That's a 200 gallon per minute system, and we're taking advantage of the recharge galleries that were currently located at this associated with this former treatment system to dispose of our treated effluent. So 2 systems, a 200 gallon and 600 gallon system, and what we've done is kind of a full life cycle cost assessment for these treatment systems, and the capital costs for resin are higher because the media is more expensive and because we have to build the regeneration system. But over time, the O&M savings on regenerating the media, and it's not just the regeneration, of course, it's the higher adsorption capacity, that after a few years, the initial capital investments pay for themselves, and you have a total life cycle cost that is lower. Both systems will be built next spring and will be commissioned next fall. I want to point it out already, but I just want to reemphasize that every water is going to present its own challenges, and that's just from the background water chemistry as well as the contaminant soup, because this is a very complex contaminant class. The configurations of PFAS for various applications are quite different, so you don't know whether you're going to have a short chain dominated plume or a long chain dominated plume, and you don't know what kind of influence your background geochemistry is going to have on the effectiveness of the media. So we are doing some ongoing trials. We're doing some iron sequestration trials at the Air Force Base in question for the systems we're building there. We're also continuing to load and regenerate the media so we can have better data, more data to determine the longevity of the media. We're looking at different distillation options to optimize the spent regenerate solution. So once we use the solvent brine to regenerate the media, we put that through a distillation process so that we can recapture the solvent and reuse it, and what we're left with is a concentrated brine paste, and that becomes our highly concentrated PFAS waste stream that we have to manage. We're looking at other regenerant solutions. The one that we're using now does trip sort of flammability requirements and has certain handling requirements that make it a challenge. So we would like to find a solution that is less hazardous to work with. And we're also looking at other adsorbent media because this particular media, we can't say unequivocally that it's always going to be the best media in all settings. And we will continue to compare that with both carbonaceous granular activated carbon and coconut-based granular activated carbon, because both of those have been used and been shown to be effective. But plenty of market opportunities for this. We have the UC MR3 data now coming out all over the place, so we know where we have impacted municipal supplies. We keep finding more and more groundwater plumes affecting communities. We know of a community in the Northeast that's installed 900 point of exposure use treatment systems, and we think we're at the tip of the iceberg, and we're going to continue to discover situations like that. Media might have an application as a pretreatment or polish on a granular activated carbon system, or vice versa. We may use the carbon to take organics out ahead of the media. It could be used in both a single use or on an exchange or on-site or exchange type of regeneration system. Exchange, I mean, think of the Culligan man. We have done some analyses that show that groundwater contaminated primarily with PFOS, which has such a higher adsorption capacity on the ion-exchange media, can still be cost-effective, cost-competitive against granular activated carbon in a single-use basis without regeneration. And then we're looking at our options for disposing of that brine. One thing is to concentrate it onto a small amount of media, so you have a solid waste to dispose of or incinerate. And then we're just starting to think about potential in situ applications. I have a diagram here from AI Solutions. We're just starting to talk about the possibility of putting the media in these chambers that are integrated to sheet pile walls, grouted sheet pile walls, to see if we can get plume cutoff and treatment. That's the end of my talk. Again, I want to acknowledge my colleague Steve Woodard over at ECT and a couple of other names here who helped us with this presentation.
Nathan, thank you for hanging into the late afternoon and giving us this information. Another great talk. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Our fourth presentation comes today from Charlie He and Bob Artizzoni of our local Carollo Engineers office in Phoenix. The title of their presentation is Treatment and Operational Strategy for Removal of PFOA and PFOS, a case study at an Arizona well field. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hey, thank you, Eric. This is Bob Artizzoni. I'm a senior project manager with Carollo here in the Phoenix office, working on water drinking systems design and challenges for the last 30 years, and I will be co-presenting with Charlie He, also from our Phoenix office. And the case study, the presentation that we have at last tier to give you this afternoon is about a case study here in Arizona, where PFOA and PFOS was discovered in a well field here in Arizona. I do want to note that it is a confidential project, so I will not be disclosing its exact location or the client. And you will notice that in some of the slides that we present, some of the data won't have some of the detail on those slides. The presentation, as the title suggests, it shows where we presented and developed an interim and long-term treatment and operation strategy to remove these two contaminants from the groundwater supply. The case study that we're presenting here also, the steps that were utilized during a project approach, you'll see can be utilized for other utilities that encounter a similar situation. So back to our presentation. I'll start off with giving a brief project background and scope of the project, and then go into, I'll hand it off to Charlie, and he will then go into the three tools that we utilized during the development of the interim and long-term treatment strategy, and then finally some take-home messages from our presentation. So in terms of some basic project background information, as I said, PFOS and PFOA were discovered in 5 drinking wells in this well field. And PFOA concentrations ranged from 5 to 200 nanograms per liter. And if you recall from Nathan's presentation, these are several orders of magnitude smaller than what some of the remediation sites that Nathan covered. So one thing to keep that in mind in comparison. The PFOS concentrations also range from about 6 to 50 nanograms per liter. 2 of the wells have PFOA and PFOS that exceed EPA's new health advisory limit of 70 parts per trillion. And also important to note that all of these wells are a critical water supply during the summer months, and therefore an immediate response was required once it was realized that the contaminants existed and in light of EPA's recent health advisory. So, in terms of the tasks that were performed, the approach that was taken to develop the interim and long-term treatment strategy, once it was detected, and because I said 2 of the wells exceeded EPA's recent health advisory, an interim treatment strategy was immediately developed so that these 2 wells could be placed in immediate operation in the summer. Corolla was brought onto the project just in April of this last year, and the goal was to get those 2 wells back into operation for the summertime. So we, as part of our interim short-term treatment strategy evaluation, we looked at GAC, RO, nanofiltration, and ion exchange, and after that evaluation, GAC was selected. We did not have time to do any pilot testing at the time, so GAC was selected since it was known already known to effectively to remove PFOS and PFOA, although we did not know exactly how long the media would last. The equipment was readily available, could be implemented by the summer, easy to operate, doesn't require powers or chemicals, and the GAC waste disposal is manageable. After we developed the interim short-term treatment strategy, we then worked also on the long-term treatment and operation strategy plan, which was also the main focus of the project. Primary part of that was an alternative evaluation, again, of the different alternative treatment technologies, which looked at the sizing, capital costs, O&M. But in addition to that, we looked at we utilized 3 tools, and Charlie's going to go into those in more detail in a moment here. But basically, the project included full-scale monitoring of the interim GAC facilities that were already placed in operation, and bench scale testing, which Charlie will go into a little bit more depth about, which involved column testing. And then we also put together a full-scale projection model, which was based on the results of the bench testing, calibrated using the full-scale results, and that model helped us can be utilized for design purposes. And at that point, I guess I'm going to turn it over to you, Charlie. I know we're running a little bit out of time, and hope you can.
Yeah, thanks for the previous speaker and Bob for setting up the stage. Instead of focusing on the successful story about this particular project, we felt like talking about some of these tools that could benefit other utilities on PFAS and PFOA treatment. This may be a better use of this time for this particular audience of this WebEx. Kind of like the analogy give a fish is better than treating the fish, we feel these tools are more valuable. And because, say, when you have an absorbent, whether it's a resin or it's carbon, and their performance may be site-specific, and under certain conditions they may work better, and other conditions you may not know whether they perform as well as the other stories. So because of that, these methodology become more important because they are common. They will show you the process and help you to capture the value and potential savings and evaluate the different resins or carbons available. Considering the time, I'll focus on these 3 main tools in the toolbox, and bench testing and full-scale monitoring and testing and operation model. We'll first start with the full-scale monitoring and testing. That is definitely the most important thing, one of the most important things after you find it's detected in your well field. And because you don't want to make a $1 million investment based on a couple data points. And so as soon as you could establish a sampling protocol and implement them, you want to continue to monitor the changing concentrations over time. And also cross the well field. So you could capture how the potential the plume is moving, and maybe in the future certain wells may even have higher concentrations. You need to think about those things. And you need to test, once you have the, say, pallet study or pallet scale on there, you need to test the raw water versus the treated sample from the first vessel and the second vessel. And you also need to consider long chain versus short chain. As you heard, long chain is effectively removed by GAC, but the short chains may not. Also, if you want to compare, say, with ion exchange or RO, you also need to collect your data for making those assessments. You might need a full ion balance to evaluate the competition with ion exchange resins and also the RO fouling and scaling. And under the other category, and you may also, for operation purpose, because PFAS, PFOA, when you send a sample to the lab, normally it could take up to 2 weeks to get the result back, and people may like to have maybe a UV254 or DOC, some other quicker indicator, so they could help them to guide the operation. However, depending on your concentration or detection limit of the different methods, it may not be feasible. I'll make a statement later based on some experience of the project. And you'll see that also you need to record your flows and your bed volumes actually being used, and that's equally important to know as the PFAS, PFOA concentration at any given time. On this chart, like Bob mentioned, some of the chart we purposely removed some of the project-specific numbers and values, but as Bob mentioned, this range of these raw water concentration of PFAS, PFOA is about 50 to 200 or 250 nanogram per liter. This is order of magnitude lower than the previous talk in terms of, say, groundwater remediation. And I would say that for certain aspects, these lower concentration could be even more challenging to treat, as some of these absorbents, whether it's resin or it's carbon, and because the driving force is much lower, the available sites on these resins absorbents that's effective for lower concentration may not be sufficient, and then it becomes even harder to remove at that lower concentration. So this could be even more challenging, and this is definitely more relevant to the municipalities considering your drinking water source. So when different manufacturer bring their absorbents or carbon, they could all claim that they have a great product. They may tell you this has a capacity of X microgram per gram, but what does that really mean? All of these could have a great story based on some other experience. However, here we introduce to you two types of bench testing setups that could help you to have your first-hand site-specific evaluation of the carbon capacity. First is the Adsorption testing, and which is used to assess the theoretical total capacity of the absorbent, and it can be used for both ion exchange or carbon, and it's very reliable for comparing different carbon product or different resins relative to each other, which one has bigger capacity. However, it's not related to full-scale operations, and it can be done fast and cost-effectively, but it gives you limited information. The second set of bench testing are these dynamic column testing called Rapid Small-Scale Column Test, RSSCT. This kind of methodology correlates better with full-scale operation. They can be used to estimate the change-off frequency at full-scale, and they're more dynamic and more difficult to do the testing. So AWWA has established standard procedures about how to conduct these testing for GAC evaluation, and the methodology has to consider scale-up hydraulic condition and pore structures. It makes sense that when you scale down from like a 12-foot full-scale vessel to a ½ centimeter or 1 centimeter small column, you have to crash the carbon down and following these procedures, and also make sure the pore structures are still representative. some carbon manufacturer may provide you these TAC-TIC analysis results showing you the structure is the same. Others may not have any of that information. So having somebody local research institute like ASU or engineers to help you make sure your testing is done with the AWWA procedure. And this is a complicated table, but I just want to quickly focus on a few things in here. And sure, you want to make sure your flow rates, your loading rates, your hydraulic condition, as these, say, Reynolds number or Schmidt number, they all representative and they can be used for the scale up. And that will help you to estimate how much sample you need, how long this testing will take, and make sure your testing is done in a representative way. And we talked a lot about breakthrough curves in the previous talk, and breakthrough, the term breakthrough is defined as the point at which your treated water is no longer meeting the treatment goal. So depending on what is your treatment intent, if you're talking about maximizing the use of your carbon, you may talk about this point A of this breakthrough curve. If you're talking about targeting a, say, 80% of the health advisory level or non-detect, you may be talking about different locations on the curve. And also, depending on how flat this curve is, you might be noticing there are significant differences in terms of the bed volumes that water can treat at expected carbon changeout. Here's some example of testing results for carbon 1 on well A water, and 2 testing matches each other pretty well. The main difference is one of the tests would last much longer, and the other test focus mainly on the short term. Depending on your treatment goal, your testing may be focusing on the area data that you really want to collect. And these results will be used to calibrate or establish your model to get your design and operation. This shows an example of an Excel model using solver and macros. And a better way to share and for utility to access such tool is maybe through our web portal and as a web app. And we are adding this particular feature as part of our groundwater treatment model, and which was used for corrosion and stability and pH blending and track your food scale flows. But now you could also put in a treatment goal of PFOS, PFOA, and you can let the model to help you to evaluate the treatment design configurations, whether you have 2 vessels in series or multiple vessels, or your estimate your carbon change-out frequency. So let's have a close look at the model results. And based on the previous breakthrough curve I showed, and we developed the model, and the green dashed line showed the model results of the water from the first vessel, and the dashed brown line shows the water from the lag vessel, and the solid line shows the final product water concentration as you switch between the leak and lag when you change out the carbon. So if you treat to 56 nanogram per liter, 80% of the HAL, and you're talking about a carbon change-out frequency of, say, next month. And in order to get the operators know when it's time to order a carbon change-out, the model also gives you a conservative, say, 3-week or 5-week warning level. So when you send out a sample to the lab, 2 weeks later you get the result, you know, oh, now I need to order carbon for the next couple of weeks. So that will give you some operation ahead of time, some warnings you can use. And also this shows that during the testing we have collected food scale samples, and when we plot the food scale data with this modeled results, the orange dots show the lead vessel product water, and the darker brown shows the lag vessel non-detect levels. And so this actually matches the model result pretty well. So you use the bench testing to establish a model, you use your food scale testing to calibrate the model, and use it continue to guide you through the operation. And this model can also be used for, say, help you with your design. Let's say when you change your treatment goal from 56 nanogram per liter to, say, if I want to achieve non-detect at all time. And if you do that, the model will have to say be adjusted so that you have to switch or change out the carbon much more frequently. And in this particular case, it could be require you to change out the carbon monthly, which is not very practical, which means the carbon is not used very efficiently. But that's why you have only 2 vessels in series in order to achieve non-detect for that particular case. Yes, you do have to replace the carbon frequently. So alternatively, if you put in some more investment capital-wise, you have 4 vessels in series. This will allow you to basically change out your frequency, extend out your change-off period, and so you don't have to change out monthly. You can use your carbon slightly more efficient. So that kind of analysis can be done with the model. So we also conducted testing with a second carbon, which demonstrated much better removal of PFOS and PFOA. In this particular case, you see that it actually throughout the testing, the second carbon actually performed very well with non-detect throughout the testing. There's no breakthrough, and this is for the first water, and then we did it for a lower concentration well, and the similar results extended out through the whole testing period. We didn't see breakthrough, and both lead and lag vessels lasted fairly long through the testing. So other results relevant, maybe relevant to you is we did see that carbon 1 removed more organics at the beginning, but carbon 2 removes, say, a good amount of carbon, and that removal lasts very long. There's no quick breakthrough. And so at very low concentration of DOC in the groundwater, really what consists of that DOC is very different. It's very site-specific. And in this particular case, the carbon may remove certain type of compounds or organic compounds more effectively. And also we noticed because of the low concentration of DOC and UV254, our wish to use UV254, for example, as a surrogate or a quick indicator to guide the PFAS PFOA removal wasn't feasible for this particular case. And also we've discussed and evaluated and considered the organics removal impact of, say, pre-oxidants or organic removal on PFAS PFOA removal, whether there's any advantage if you do any oxidation ahead of the PFAS PFOA removal. If you can, say, free out the capacity and improve, maybe you can improve the PFAS PFOA. So we also consider centralized versus individual well fields, consider footprint for future in case the water quality will deteriorate over time. And also when you have your long-term goal and you design these treatment facility, other contaminants in the water or maybe on the regulatory horizon may also need to be considered. Also, we are doing a testing for, we're starting a testing for a third carbon and try to evaluate additional benefit of capturing these other adsorbents. And so that's ongoing. And this is kind of showing you if we didn't do any testing and if different manufacturers with carbon suppliers come and offer and give us a ballpark capacity, and we may estimate the O&M manual be this high. And however, when we do the testing, it will allow us to avoid, say, shooting in the dark and with no first-hand knowledge. And this allows us to make assumptions, conservative assumptions, but not be overly conservative. And so we can capture some of these saving opportunities, and we can operate with confidence and have less stress on the time of change out and the frequent sampling and the analytical costs. Take-home message, media, whether it's carbon or resins, the selection may be site-specific, and you may have a great story of some carbon under different concentration, different type of water, but that may not be true for every water. And several tools help utilities to develop customized solutions and help you to capture your savings. And GAC could be a great interim option for emergency response at low concentration of PFAS PFOA because both of them are long-chain contaminants. And long-term cost effectiveness, however, must be evaluated through testing and modeling. RSSCT and the modeling we introduced in this presentation can provide you firsthand scalable and valuable insights to get your design and operation. And thank you for your time.
Charlie and Bob, thank you for bringing that information to us. And with that said, I'd like to thank our various Carollo and AMEC Foster Wheeler offices and participants. For any attendees, if you have any information to advocate for our industry and make it better and make it available and for the betterment of water treatment, please contact us. We're out of time. For those who had questions, you have the contact information for the various participants. For those who couldn't make it today, and also for you who are attending, Charlie He will have a December presentation on the subject with American Water Works Association. So go to the American Water Works Association website, and you have Charlie's contact information to send him that you're interested. There'll be 2 presentations in 2017, which Charlie will be a part of. And if you send him your contact information, he'll keep you plugged in on when those 2017 events are. Thank you for attending today's presentation. I hope you found the content interesting, and good luck with your continued careers.